Abdi Omar is having a bad day. He works for Banadir Regional Council and his patch is downtown Mogadishu. Today he is short-staffed. And some of the residents are still adjusting to having their rubbish collected at all. But even a bad day for Abdi is an encouraging sign for his city. For much of the last 20 years, taking to the streets was a daily lottery, let alone cleaning them for a living. Since the collapse of the last government, Somalia has been a comprehensively failed state. Getting back to the point where people like Abdi are free to go to work has been a long and difficult process. This is the story of how Somalia has emerged from decades of war, famine, and anarchy. Across Somalia, the first fruits of peace are starting to be enjoyed by ordinary people. Mogadishu and many of the major cities have been stabilized by the African Union Mission to Somalia, or AMISOM, working with the Somali National Army and federal government. When AMISOM arrived in 2007 to counter the growing threat of Islamist extremism, the UN was unable to send any troops of its own. Instead, the decision was made to supply the African Union mission with everything it needed to survive, except weapons. This support was channeled through the United Nations Support Office for AMISOM, or UNSOA. It was a bold strategy. This was not the first time the international community had tried to intervene in Somalia. In 1991, the military dictatorship of Mohammed Siad Barre was toppled by a popular uprising. Bitter rivalries between the country's clans that had been held in check exploded into war.
When the government of Siad Barre collapsed, so did all the institutions of state. The city of Mogadishu was taken over by competing clan militia.
Somalia is a unique place where clanship and elders and alliances are the kind of things that hold them together and also tear them apart.
As the clans turned on each other and the country spiraled further into anarchy, a drought in the hinterland rapidly turned into devastating famine. Andy Hill was a Reuters journalist covering the crisis in 1992.
It was an anarchic situation. I remember arriving and being picked up in a UN minivan, and there was blood all over the back seat. And my guide said to me, don't worry about the blood. One of our staff was here and got shot the other day. And it was like that. It was chaos. And when you went out into the countryside, there were kids dying all over the place. It was one of the worst situations I've ever seen.
Fighting had spread all over the country. There was fighting going on in Baidawa, there was fighting going on in Juba, there was mayhem and genocide.
The UN responded quickly, sending in humanitarian aid agencies protected by a small number of troops. But what was meant to be a peacekeeping and humanitarian mission quickly became bogged down in the confusing and volatile security situation. Ali Mohammed Gedi, who would go on to be Prime Minister of Somalia, was on the ground as things began to unravel.
I was one of the professional scholars who were there. So from the beginning, we were feeling that that operation was not going to succeed. Each area was controlled by a clan or sub-clan, with a warlord leading his own community. There was no law and order.
The aid agencies could not deliver food because of the general lawlessness and banditry. There was a lot of good intentions. It was a mission that was humanitarian at its heart, and they wanted to get food to the people who needed it. But to do that, they needed security, but they never really got it. I don't think the food that was in the warehouses got distributed to the people who most needed it, because anarchy was the obstruction and the warlords were the agent of that anarchy, and they were in control.
As aid piled up in warehouses while Somalis continued to starve, the UN realized that more troops were needed to restore order.
Peacekeeping troops have already withdrawn from the main compound in Mogadishu.
Emergency Resolution 794 mandated a force of 30,000 international troops spearheaded by America to ensure that aid was delivered by force if necessary.
The arrival of the Americans to beef up the UN force was stage managed. It was Hollywood, people sort of emerging from the seas and being applauded.
The people were welcoming the Americans. People were standing on the streets of Mogadishu. They were waving flags to welcome the Americans coming to Somalia.
It seemed that Somalia was ready to be saved. But the goodwill evaporated very quickly in the white heat of Mogadishu.
There was a honeymoon period, and in the background, political negotiations were going on, but it didn't last very long. And of course, the turning point was that a convoy of Pakistanis was ambushed and killed.
The brutal attack was carried out by a militia loyal to warlord General Mohammed Farah Aidid. Aidid had been a minister in the Siad Barre government and was a shrewd, ruthless political operator.
The Americans decided to pick a bone with General Aidid, who had already decided that he was the legitimate leader of the revolution.
With his ambition to rule the country, Aidid had little to gain from a negotiated peace. He ruthlessly provoked the international force who had failed to grasp a basic fact about Somali loyalty and fell into his trap.
Aidid started propaganda. Somalis are very attached to sovereignty, nationalistic, patriotism. So these are invaders immediately got more support for the young people, unemployed, who had nothing to do but to fight.
Today, the US Marines raided the stronghold of General Mohammed Aidid.
They declared him a wanted man.
Aerial gunships launched a barrage of cannon and rocket fire.
They sent out raids for him.
By daylight, missiles picked off more ground targets.
And it became a standoff between the American military under a UN flag and Aidid.
As the battle against Aidid intensified and civilians were killed by forces sent to keep the peace, the final straw came when American special forces unilaterally staged a daring raid to capture the elusive warlord in downtown Mogadishu. What followed would have major implications for future peacekeeping missions around the world. Images of dead American soldiers dragged through the streets fatally weakened the resolve of the international community to intervene in foreign conflicts.
You've got to remember that this is the 1990s, we're talking post-Vietnam. You know, a single American soldier dead in those days was massive news. And the American administration did not want its boys coming back in body bags from another distant conflict.
They left. Aidid felt more powerful, whereas Americans felt that they lost that war and abandoned Somalia completely.
From the warlord's point of view, from the point of view of the men with guns, the world's biggest army had been defeated.
Little more than a year later, the last international troops left Somalia. It was a black day for peacekeeping. With the withdrawal of international forces, Somali society fragmented and the country slipped back into anarchy.
When the international community left, Somalia has been divided into clan fiefdoms, and people learned to survive under the umbrella of clan.
The gangsters took over, the warlords took over. It was the darkest time that Somalia had. Everything collapsed.
Somali people felt that the world community have abandoned the Somali people in that disaster where they were in. So it was really a desperation.
Out of this desperation grew a grassroots movement that tried to restore order.
While all that division going on, there's an underground system which was the Islamists coming together.
The Islamic Union of Courts grew as an authority in Mogadishu and for a while imposed some kind of order.
People felt, hey, these are the guys who we feel can give us fairness of the society, can give us my rights, can provide us the security.
They were trying to manage the streets. It was some kind of community policing in the absence of a government institution.
They tried to pacify Mogadishu by saying we will apply Sharia law to the country.
They were very successful in Mogadishu. They fought the warlords and kicked them out of town. That was their biggest achievement.
By 2006, a transitional federal government did exist within Somalia. But it was powerless to take on the warlords, and for a people so weary of war and chaos, supporting the Islamists was the only practical option.
The Somali people are people who want peace, who want some sort of government, who want some sort of leadership. So anyone who brings that system can take the opportunity of their support.
They won the hearts and minds of every citizen. We were in full support of the Islamic Courts Union.
But the Union of Islamic Courts was in reality a loose coalition, containing groups with a variety of different ideologies and agendas.
There were some positive aspects, but also very negative aspects. Some of them had another hidden agenda: radicalism, extremism, fanaticism.
And now, international concerns began to impact on Somalia once again. The threat of hardline Islamism began to alarm other countries in the region.
It worried a lot of people outside of Somalia because of the rise of fundamental Islam in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere.
They felt if the Islamic Courts Union got in power, Islamic State is declared, and all those people who Al-Qaeda associated might come here, so they had their own agenda.
Nervous of the Islamic court's influence on its own large ethnic Somali population, neighboring Ethiopia poured thousands of troops into the country and drove the Islamists out of the cities. As the Union of Islamic Courts splintered, the moderates fled abroad, leaving behind the more hardline armed wing, known as Al-Shabaab.
You could say that there was something here homegrown and working to a degree, and it was crushed by the traditional enemy, Ethiopia. You could argue that that was what created Al-Shabaab.
Others argue that Al-Shabaab had existed for some time, but was waiting for an opportunity to emerge.
Crashing the Islamic Courts Union did not produce terrorists or terrorism. They were there and they were terrorists.
People felt that Al-Shabaab are the soldiers of the Islamic Courts Union, so the people supported that, not knowing Al-Shabaab and their agendas.
Al-Shabaab portrayed the Ethiopians as foreign invaders and the transitional government as their puppets in order to win public support. Enforcing an often brutal interpretation of Sharia law, they took over large swathes of the country.
They were terrorizing people, they were cutting off their hands, they were stoning to girls of 14, 16 years old, and the beheadings, it was Al-Shabaab who were doing all these atrocities.
Those who had the ideology of Al-Qaeda are the ones who started slaughtering the people in the mosques, in the houses, in the streets, everywhere.
Since the fall of the Siad Barre regime, Somalia had endured 15 years of famine, war, and anarchy. A series of misguided interventions had left the country broken and falling into the hands of extremists. With foreign jihadis flocking to al-Shabaab's banner and the transitional federal government still very weak, the UN knew they had to act. But past failures had cast a long shadow. A new approach was needed. January 2007. Following 15 years of civil war and failed foreign intervention, Somalia is occupied by Ethiopian troops whose presence is propping up a weak transitional government. Facing them are the growing forces of Islamist extremism in the shape of al-Shabaab. The group controls large areas of southern Somalia and is staging guerrilla attacks on government forces. With foreign jihadis flocking to join the fight, Somalia's neighbors put together a plan to stop the instability spreading to infect the wider region. On January 19, 2007, the African Union set up a mission to Somalia to be called AMISOM. Its goal, to protect the transitional government and give it space to work by restoring security. The first country to step forward is Uganda, and within 2 months, 1,650 troops are on the ground in Mogadishu.
Uganda decided enough of this. We can't sit on our hands because what's happening in Somalia could affect all of us, and they decided to act.
Major General Fred Mugisha, who later became force commander of AMISOM in Mogadishu, understood the threat.
Terrorism here and everywhere else, it is something that you need to eradicate. If you don't, then it's going to engulf East Africa and eventually, of course, make life very difficult for the people. So I think it was time for African countries to step in and sort out the problems.
For Major General Nathan Mugisha, who would also go on to command AMISOM, there was more than pure pragmatism behind the decision to get involved.
When we had problems here in Uganda during Amin's time, Siad Barre came in to help the situation, and therefore there was that spirit of Pan-Africanism to give a helping hand to our sisters and brothers in Somalia.
You must have seen pictures of the dying people, hungry people for about 2 decades. So any other sensible African leader would do that to really help the suffering of the people.
As soon as the first contingent of Ugandan troops touched down at Mogadishu International Airport, they were under attack.
The situation was very, very rough. There was enemy all over the place.
One of the aircrafts was attacked as it was landing. There were mortar shells as they were arriving. So from the word go, they were received with hostility.
When the Ugandans arrived here, the situation was dire. There was nothing. There was a shell-shocked airport. There was no water, no accommodation, no hospitals. They were mortared, they were shot at, they were sniped at. They arrived to absolutely nothing.
The media all over, they were saying the mission is dead on arrival, that will not make any headway in the situation of Somalia, so it was very, very difficult.
Reinforcements arrived from Burundi, but still the force was outnumbered and outmaneuvered by al-Shabaab, who tightened their grip on Mogadishu. Craig Goodwin was a UN logistics specialist seconded to the African Union at the time.
There were some very, very good generals in charge of AMISOM to start with, and they realized that all they could do was hold the line. The analysis was coming back to the African Union and to the UN. Yep, I can hold this line, or I can leave.
By 2009, the mission was on a knife edge, trapped in a defensive posture, without the manpower or supplies to do much more. Specialist observers like Craig were under no illusions that the UN would have to get involved.
It was crisis management in terms of funds to support these guys, and I think something had to be done. So I think there was a realization somewhere along the line that we had to support AMISOM more from a military and support point of view.
But mindful of the past, no international country was prepared to put boots on the ground.
Put simply, the UN said, we must send a peacekeeping force to Somalia. Who's going to contribute? And nobody put their hand up.
Faced with this seemingly impossible dilemma, within the UN, a groundbreaking collaboration was being devised. Never before had UN member countries' money been used to pay for a peacekeeping operation led by a different regional body.
We created this new department called the Department of Field Support, and I think it was probably through the new USG, Susanna Mokora, who saw an opportunity to actually get involved and solve this unpredictable funding of AMISOM.
Resolution 1863 set up the UN Support Office for AMISOM, or UNSOA, a field support operation tasked with providing vital supplies to AMISOM troops. Amadou Kamara is the head of UNSOA in the field.
UNSOA is unique in many ways. It's the only stand-alone support operations in the Department of Field Support. It had to be very creative because this was not peacekeeping in traditional sense. It was a full and active combat duty. So UNSOA developed some practices to be able to keep up with the support in this kind of volatile environment.
UNSOA swung into action immediately, opening a direct supply route by sea from Mombasa into Mogadishu, which hugely increased the amount of supplies available.
UNSOA was bringing food rations for the soldiers, basic necessities like camp beds, tents. In other words, they were supporting the lifeline of a soldier in the field. The provision of those logistics increased the troops' morale and it made it easier to conduct the operations in a very hostile environment.
Fuel and engineering facilities for AMISOM's armoured transports followed, along with support vehicles and then accommodation blocks for the troops. Communications and IT, medical and aviation, everything to equip a modern army in the field was brought into Mogadishu to strengthen AMISOM's footing and free them up to concentrate on Al-Shabaab.
If you actually went out onto the front line, it was a traditional front line as per World War I. It was a line that ran across Mogadishu. If you were up in an outpost, you could put your binoculars up and see Al-Shabaab waving at you from the other side. They were a military force, and they held 80% of Mogadishu.
AMISOM needed to take the initiative, and now with UNSOA support, they could. Better fed, better equipped, the African Union forces could get stuck into the tricky business of urban warfare.
Fighting in built-up area is one of the most difficult phases because you have to make an operation from one house to another, and each house is different from the other.
We had a smaller force, not enough to cover the whole city. You are not seeing the enemy. The enemy knows his territory more than you do. So it's very, very difficult.
As AMISOM inched further and further into the hostile maze of Mogadishu, casualties began to mount.
They have taken a lot of hits. Early on, they didn't want to admit that, but they have. They are certainly willing to put, their lives on the line. They've been good fighters.
AMISOM has been out there and has shed blood trying to bring peace to Somalia. The UN was deeply reluctant to lose a single soldier.
As a commander, you don't want to see 10 or so of your soldiers injured, some dead. But you lose a lot more by not defeating the terrorists from that part of the East Africa. So I think that was a very, very big motivation.
Yet the casualties would certainly have been higher without the medical support that had been delivered to the mission.
UNSOA was tasked to support the medical and casualty evacuation of troops. I think that one was very, very important because at that material time we needed that assistance.
By now, a level 2 field hospital had been built on the base in Mogadishu. Added to this, a private jet could put critically injured soldiers in intensive care in Nairobi within hours.
The the experiences that they've learnt through battlefield injuries has given a lot of the soldiers there, the confidence that, I'm going to be looked after if I get injured on the battlefield. And, I think that's important to an infantryman.
Another unpleasant byproduct of urban warfare is civilian casualties, and there is no doubt that these did occur. What AMISOM did not expect was how ruthless Al-Shabaab would be in using civilians for propaganda purposes.
They would hide, for example, amongst the civilians and start firing bombs into the positions of African Union troops. You can't respond with fire, because if you ever do, then you cause casualties. And that's what they want, to be able to portray you as evil.
Al-Shabaab had a sophisticated propaganda machine, and they knew they could harness the public support if they portrayed the AMISOM troops as foreign invaders fighting Islam.
Exhausted by the relentless raids of the Mujahideen, the Ugandan crusaders and their apostate allies had earlier given up all hope of regaining the territory they had lost.
Of course, they were using a lot of propaganda. They would come near AMISOM positions and share into their areas and target the civilian areas, and then say this fire is from AMISOM, which is from this direction to this. They tried all this.
Most of the reports were stage managed. There were claims which were not true, but all aimed at winning the public and international community.
Some of the footage that they've put out is quite incredible. I remember when, unfortunately, AMISOM lost a tank, and the mileage that Al-Shabaab made out of that tank, it was very professional. So, these guys understand media.
The lessons of previous missions that ran into trouble when they lost the support of the Somali public were not to be forgotten. Perhaps one of the key areas of UNSOA support was a public information system that could level the playing field.
You must counter their accusations, their allegations, to go and explain, to go and give information to the people.
It's trying to get the truth out there to the Somalis, that this is actually what happened and not what Al-Shabaab said. And hence, these radio stations that have been trained by UNSOA and have been supported by UNSOA, are now a target.
The coming of the ICT program helped us to tell the truth amongst the so many lies and propaganda by the extremist forces.
House by house, street by street, fighting an enemy that was well dug in on their home turf, the African Union forces alongside Somali government troops finally expelled Al-Shabaab from Mogadishu in August 2011.
This was a very difficult mission. Almost everybody in the world had given up on Somalia, but this time around, it's a new chapter. There is hope, and there is a lot of optimism.
The battle that they had with Al-Shabaab to take control of Mogadishu, this was no ragtag army. These guys were well trained, well dug in, well organized, and it took a real army to dislodge them.
When we finally did push them out of the city, thousands and thousands of people started fleeing from all over to come inside Mogadishu, to be able to access logistics from UN organizations, at least to be able to have some relative security.
As well as opening up a safe haven for internally displaced people, the retaking of Mogadishu fulfilled a key part of the mission's mandate, to create a stable environment for the government to function. But there was little time to enjoy the achievement. With Al-Shabaab still controlling huge swathes of south-central Somalia, the advance had to continue. But now, fighting in open country, the conditions favored AMISOM's superior equipment and training. Within months, Afgoye, Baidoa, Beledweyne, Marka, and Kismayo had been retaken. But with these successes came serious challenges. AMISOM's supply lines expanded 100-fold almost overnight, and UNSOA had to work out very quickly how to keep up.
The logistics challenges now are more on us because we need heavy transport. They were only moving food and fuel around Mogadishu. Now you've got to move it 240 kilometres. So, you know, the challenges have changed. The logistics challenges for UNSOA have changed.
Al-Shabaab, as they become increasingly asymmetrical, have resorted to using IEDs on our major supply routes, making it very difficult to supply goods and services.
This was a force that is fighting. The UNSOA was not formatted to be able to cope with the speed of the advance on the battlefield.
When you're fighting a war, the soldiers on the ground want reaction, where we have a procurement system that's built for peacekeeping. So we've had to look at different ways of doing business ourselves.
And the combat operations created further needs for the mission to meet. As the front line pushed out, security and the rule of law had to be maintained in freshly liberated areas where no functioning state had existed for years. Nigeria and Ghana joined those nations already contributing to AMISOM in the creation of an African Union police force, also supported by UNSOA with equipment and training. As well as active patrols, the force's mission is to train its Somali counterparts across the spectrum of policing techniques. UNSOA has been breaking new ground since its inception, so one of the defining characteristics of the model was flexibility and the light footprint compared to normal UN missions.
We only had one guy on the ground to start with, and it grew from there. And now we've probably got 100 souls on the ground in Mogadishu. That's probably as big as we need to get. All those back office functions, let's keep them back office.
The Global Field Support Strategy is a very important initiative of the United Nations. It's made it safer, it's allowed for more cost efficiencies, and also is allowed for a more rational use of resources that are entrusted in our care.
By outsourcing much of the work that would have been done by UN staff in the past, UNSOA has been a more nimble operation at every level.
We haven't got 600 support staff sitting in Nairobi or Mogadishu doing what we would traditionally do. We've had to look at using contractors. We're not an engineering company. We're not a communications company. We're not a medical company. And I think contracting it out to third parties is actually better because they are in the commercial world. You know, they sink or swim by their performance.
As it became clear that the new model was not only viable but effective, more African nations stepped forward to provide troops to AMISOM. Somalia's northern neighbor, Djibouti, sent a battalion to the strategic town of Beledweyne. Months later, Kenyan troops joined the mission, crossing Somalia's southern border by land and sea to retake the vital port city and Al-Shabaab stronghold of Kismayo. By the start of 2014, Sierra Leone and Ethiopia also had troops on the ground. 6 separate sovereign nations now contribute to an African mission to restore peace to Somalia, all underpinned by UN logistical support for the first time in history. What makes the recent successes of the mission more remarkable is that there was no guarantee it would work.
Sure, there was risks and it was a bit of a gamble. We've got involved in things that in peacekeeping we wouldn't traditionally get involved in.
There was skepticism. Some member states and even some bodies of the United Nations questioned the prudence of having a support entity stand alone, and they questioned the accountability reporting lines.
What the UN contribution has been is to use the UN's experience, expertise in terms of the logistic support necessary to underpin and support the African Union element.
A situation like Somalia, it's not only guns and bombs and this. Soldiers need food. They need some tents. They are human beings like me and you. So when they are advancing, they need logistical support.
You can take troops anywhere in the world, but what determines their success is how to sustain them. The sustainability was done properly. That increased the morale and put in life in the soldier to do his job.
I think it's been a striking partnership between the United Nations and the African Union, which has come together in order to achieve something quite remarkable in terms of the benefit for Somali people.
But while AMISOM's military successes against Al-Shabaab are obvious, what about those whom the mission is supposed to be helping? Are the Somali people really benefiting from the efforts of the African Union and its UN backers? The African Union mission to Somalia, supported by the UN, has achieved dramatic military successes against Al-Shabaab. But what does this mean for ordinary Somalis? Has there been a real peace dividend for a people exhausted by 20 years of war? To see how far things have changed since AMISOM arrived in 2007, a useful place to start is Mogadishu's bustling international airport. For the first time in decades, many more people are arriving than are leaving. Men and women from the diaspora are pouring in to do business or rebuild lives in the country of their birth. 7 years ago, the only planes landing here were military transports bringing African Union troops. Brigadier Peter Elwelu was commanding the Ugandan contingent.
As we landed, some few minutes after the welcoming ceremony, mortars started landing on us. The security around the airport was not good, so we had to take up the security of the airport immediately.
Conditions then were primitive at best. But when the UN began to support the AMISOM mission and resources poured in, the character of the airport began to change. The foxholes and primitive dressing station were replaced by accommodation blocks and a hospital. During 2011, the airport was secure enough for civilian flights to return, and by December of that year, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was able to fly in. 3 months later, the first major international flights into the airport for 20 years began, as Turkish Airlines launched a twice-weekly service. To set the seal on a dramatic turnaround in the fortunes of the airport, Somalia's first formal parliament for 2 decades was sworn in here in August 2012. Today, as businessmen, cargo, and returning families stream through Aden Abdullah International Airport, it has become a portal to Somalia's growing recovery. Across the city, that recovery is being driven by the enterprising spirit for which Somalis are famous. Abdirahman Sheikh Abdi runs an electronic shop in Mogadishu and business is booming.
marka sida u jeed halkan waxa loo godaa electronic kala duwan oo tayo sareyso marka sidaas oo ay kamid tahay flashyada memoryasha GB-yaasha iyo mobilada sareeto oo sida madax sareeto ama hay'adaha ama rag mas'uuliyad ay qaataan sida Galaxy Galaxy Note Galaxy 3 Galaxy 4 all sida arkays mobilada hadda baladka sida aan rajeynay insha Allah dadkaas oo walaalayna oo Soomaaliyeed oo qurbo dibadda ka imaaday ayaa wadankii dhismayaal fara badan ka hirgeliyay haday noqoto ganacsi fara badan economic haday noqoto business waxyaabo fara badan marka sidaan filan sidaas waaye oo ayaga dhaqaale fara badan wadankii soo gulasho waxyaabo fara badan keenay haddii ay noqoto hay'adaha hataa oo amniyaadka waxyaabo fara badan ay dawladda nafteeda dadaal fara badan ay wadaa.
This is Bakara Market, the single biggest and one of the most important trading districts in the country. Here, the growing optimism of the business community is written in bold across the many shop fronts. But Bakara has a very checkered history. It was here 20 years ago that the US Black Hawk helicopter crashed, sparking off a major gun battle that would kill 18 Americans and unknown hundreds of Somalis. During the warlord years, Bakara became famous as a place where Somalis could buy more than just their weekly groceries.
It had before a market called Irtokte, which is the sky shooters. A lot of people were selling guns, ammunition, bombs, everything. So you go to the market, buy a gun, then test it in the market. So that's why they call it Irtokte.
With the arrival of Al-Shabaab, Bakara took on a new significance.
It was not under control of the government, It was controlled by extremists.
It was an area where people are being assassinated. So people go to the market and they are being killed.
It was a platform for mobilization, a platform for logistic support for the terrorism that was going on.
After fierce fighting, the district was at last returned to its rightful place as a key trading hub for ordinary Somalis trying to get on with their businesses.
We cut off the business that was preparing the war. And then the extremist forces got disorganized. They are never recovered from that loss.
For traders like Abdi Rahman, the security gains have provided the breathing space for businesses to flourish.
LG dhalo life good ah oo cabirkeedu yahay 42 80 mislin oo waaweynka yararka kuwana waa marwaxado oo qaboojiyaal dadka ay ku raaxaystaan ku baashaan sida arkaysa kuwaasna moolkiis waaye waa kuwa lagu shiito cabitaanaadka amniga maasha Allah the beast okay waaye boqolkii waxa waa 75 80% waa wax la isku haleyn karo maasha Allah wax qashaada wax fooda wax malaan sharciya jir macnaha oo dawladda hoosa sida mashibida canshuur waxyaabo noocaas qaadaan wadanka maasha Allah sidoo hore oo ma dhaw kun iyo kow jar waa uu ka sarmaray.
The recent improvements that are allowing business to flourish have also affected another area of life, one that is often a casualty of war. This is Konis Stadium in central Mogadishu, and Mogadishu Port are playing fierce local rivals Genio. It's a work day, so the stadium is only half full, but on a Friday it will regularly fill to its capacity of 15,000. Built by the Italians in 1956, it is Somalia's oldest stadium and once hosted international competitions. Mohamed Khalaf captained the Somali national team in 1951. The state-of-the-art pitch is less than a year old, but Mohamed has seen the stadium go through some much harder times. During the war, Konis was reduced to rubble. Under Al-Shabaab, it was used for more sinister purposes, as was Mogadishu's main stadium.
This is where they were keeping some of the explosives. This is where they would hold their meetings.
It was misused grossly for warfare, recruitment, punishment of people, but in most cases, artillery, or could say mortar shelling of the town.
For many years, the city's sporting arenas were places where sport could barely be practiced, let alone enjoyed by thousands. But the return of stability has allowed renovation to begin, and young Somalis like Fada to indulge their passion for football. Yet tragically, for young Somalis like this, peace is an alien concept. Anyone under the age of 20 has grown up with nothing but war. For children like these at Al-Kaltar school in Mogadishu's Medina district, the stability of today is a new experience. The headmistress here is Zara Aden. She has been providing an education for young people in Mogadishu for 20 years, right through the heaviest fighting.
wuxuu hool samata bixin waxayna ku tiirsanaan jireen ilahaas oo dhan ii sheeg contribution ka iska ururiyaan ii sheeg dadka funderiska ah iyo ii sheeg waalidiinta sida gaarka ah iskuulka u danaynayo oo wax badan nagala qabto howlaha waxbarashada marka waxaan uga qayb qaadan jirnay dagaalada wax iska common ahayd ma ahayn wax oo annaga si gaar ah noo haystay xilligii markaas meesha aan la geli karin meel alla meeshii deegaan oo markaas oo seefin ahaa ilmaha la keeni jiray xagga qarashaadkana waxa waa ardaygii markaas aad biduruuf ay u diido in aan annaga ka caawino.
Keeping a school running through decades of war and anarchy came at a price.
Horta waxaa jiray dhibaatooyin aad u fara badan oo la soo maray waxaan hadda ka xusi karaa waxaa jirtay baabuur darawal oo xilligii intaanan la gaarin xilliyadan dambe aanan la gaarin oo xilliga qabaa'ilka baabuur ilmo noo saaran aanin lagu dilay nasiib wanaag waa maalinkii ugu yaabka badnaa ilmo yaryar oo xeerkaas gaarsiisan oo dhibaatadaas dhacday in isla markii waalidiinta ka mid aad aan waalidiinta iskuulka wax ka dhigay aad u xisaab waxa dhacday in waalidkaas uu ilmaha soo ururiyay cunug ilmahaas ka mid xataa maskaxda wax ay ka gaareen oo aad u qaraacmay oo barbaleen xoogna muddo sanad ku dhawaad cunuga la xanuunsan marka dhibaatada horta noogu badneed oo aad aan oga qaraacan midaas ay ahayd.
For Zara, the risks were worth the rewards of education.
Wallahi qofka markuu asaga uu soo baxay hadaf uu ku soo baxaa aniga hadafka aan ku soo baxay ma ahayn dib markaas gaar inaan ku haro.
And now, carrying on her work is getting easier day by day.
Wallahi horta markii loo barbar dhigo xilliyo hore iyo hadda way kala duwan tahay laakiin wali caqabadaha jiro culayska wali waa taagan yahay laakiin sidii hore hadda xoogaa waa laga wada rooyay leena waxaa jirta xilli aan galabtii shaqada aan joojinay leena aan u joojinay la duruuf dagaalo darteed iyo barbaleen darteed marka waxaan leeyahay xilligii hore hadaan la abaal darsanayay hadda inay xoogaa wax badan ay ka fiican tahay alxamdulillah.
Mogadishu in 2014 resembles very much what Mogadishu was like in 1992 before all hell broke loose. There are shops, there are people going about their business, there are new cars. If you go to the airport, this doesn't look like a city under siege. There are international flights arriving all day long.
The streets are full of people, the markets are bustling. Go to the Lido beach on a Friday and you'll find thousands of Somalis out there enjoying themselves. So, life is definitely returning. Compared to the very dark days of just over 2 years ago, this is a much, much brighter Mogadishu.
We don't hear the gun shots that we used to hear every day. Business are coming back. Life is coming back to normal. And instead of people not knowing in the morning what will happen, whether they die or not, now that is not the case.
But although the recent improvements are unprecedented, Somalia's recovery is still very fragile.
The difficulty that we have is this. As a government, at one point we are at war with Al-Shabaab. 2, we're trying to rebuild our forces. And 3, we lack the resources that we need. We are doing 3 at the same time. In the real world, you reform, you rebuild your forces while you're not at war.
In these conditions, how can the fledgling Somali government and the international community build on recent successes to forge a lasting peace? The improvements brought about by the African Union mission to Somalia are clear. But what is less clear is how to build on those gains.
I would say that it's a job nowhere near done. This should be the start of a long-term investment in a place that has the capacity to jeopardize its neighbors and faraway countries for decades to come.
We are not yet through with this problem. Not until you have liberated the entire Somalia. We need to get the Shabab out.
They're getting weaker, and as they do so, they're becoming a little more dangerous in terms of their terrorist tactics.
We have seen an increase of asymmetric warfare. We have seen change of tactics. We have seen suicide bombs. they know that they lost the war, and now they're trying to show their presence to the outsiders that they're still there, they can still pose threat.
Population of Somalia is also key actors to fight against this tactic of Al-Shabaab.
But perhaps the greatest threat from Al-Shabaab is not their bombs, but their propaganda. If they can convince Somali public opinion that the African Union mission is a foreign crusade against their nation and religion, could it go the same way as previous foreign interventions?
They want to mobilize Islam to get more support. Terrorism has nothing to do with Islam. It is not religion. It is not color. It is not language. It is terrorism. So associating that the world community or African Union are fighting against Islam, it is a very cheap excuse.
We need to win the war of hearts and minds. We need to provide services to the people and to meet the people's expectations.
It won't be easy. Somalia is a country that has a lot of recovering to do.
The infrastructure is greatly degraded. Roads and transport links are poor. After 22 years of not having a state, institutions are very weak. Most countries recovering from conflict will take more or less the same time as the conflict lasted to emerge in any sort of sustainable way.
I think we still need the African Union force to remain for the next 3 or 4 years to empower the federal institutions so people can see the peace dividend. People need to see it's their government who is providing the security, the basic and the services.
The long-term future of Somalia must lie with the Somalis themselves, so the mission needs an exit strategy.
Somalia must build their forces, then take over from AMISOM. If that will not happen, we cannot sustain peace.
The single most important fact in Somalia, it is the Somali National Force. Bring all those militias together under one command and control, train them, be able to have a force that can hold the country together. Because time comes, AMISOM will get out. What is going to happen if we have not consolidated that principle of building a Somali National Force?
But with the legacy of decades of civil war, creating a Somali national force is a difficult balancing act for the international community.
We're at the stage now where member states are probably a little bit on the fence. They're frightened that if they build up the strength of the Somali National Army and then the political side breaks down, you end up with well-trained warlords that are well-equipped.
So for the time being, AMISOM will continue to bear the brunt of enforcing the peace. But is it ethical for the international community to fund African nations to fight on their behalf, as some critics argue?
I think the Africans within their region understand the problems better and they have interest in quickly solving these problems.
In the first place, this is an African country. I don't see a force from Canada or US or any other countries far distant away from Somalia that will do what we did, including taking casualties to the level we did.
They were prepared to make the sacrifice in terms of blood if the West would make the sacrifice in terms of financial support. You can't really compare the two, but you can argue that a mix of the two has made a huge change for the life of Somalis. And after all, that's what really counts, not who does what. It's whether people who've known nothing but warfare, early deaths, disease and hunger are going to have a future with some hope. And I think that's what's growing here.
Somalia has been a test case for the UNSOA model. The country still has a long way to go, but the experience here of African peacekeepers with international backing could have major implications for the way the UN does business in the future.
Africans, solving their African problems is a priority in my opinion. But alone they cannot do it. We are tackling international terrorism. So we have to unite our forces and the resources and minds to address terrorism worldwide.
This experience of African Union and UNSOA can be a good model for African conflict. Many countries are involved. Africa is able to bring solution to the African problem. I think is a very good one.
You can't divide what AMISOM has achieved from the fact that it's been supported all the way with the logistics it requires. It's a vast operation. Somebody has to help them, and it's in everybody's interest to see a peaceful Somalia. So I see it more as an African solution with international support.
Without the African Union, without the AMISOM, Somalia would not have reached the peace and the stability that we have seen now, and the hope that we have for our country and our future.